I'm Blaise Misztal, a fellow here at the Hudson Institute, and because we have a short amount of time, I'm going to pivot as quickly as we can to our excellent panel. And luckily, I do not have to give out reminders about Chatham House rules. We are on the record. So thank you for joining us for this discussion about the future of U.S. Africa relations. Those of you in the room, those of you viewing us on C-SPAN and online. I'm delighted to be joined by a really outstanding panel. I'll just go ahead and introduce them and dive into questions. We have about 40 minutes, and I'll try to reserve 10 to 15 of those for questions from the audience. So immediately to my left, we have Ambassador Ramayade, a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and a teacher of African Affairs at Sciences Po Paris. She had a very distinguished career in public service in France, including as the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Human Rights and the Ambassador of France to UNESCO. We're really happy to have her in Washington and sharing her insights with us. Next to her, Joshua Mizerve is a Senior Policy Analyst on Africa and the Middle East at the Heritage Foundation. He was previously also at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and spent several years on the ground in Africa, including with the Peace Corps. And last but not least, Mvemba Dizolele is a senior advisor to the International Republican Institute, a lecturer in African Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic International Studies, and a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps as well. Thank you for joining us. Maybe I could start with the way that Ken Weinstein set up this event with his introduction, talking about Africa as a continent of both promise and peril, and ask all of you which of those you see as the more prominent right now, or what the balance is between the challenges and opportunities, and what the greatest ones are on the continent that U.S. policy should be focused on. Ambassador Yade, can I start with you?
Yeah, it was interesting to see that Africa has to face opportunities on the one hand, and on the other hand, challenges. The truth is both, but I'd like to be optimistic, and I'd like to focus on the optimistic part of the speech we heard. The opportunities are really huge and amazing. Africa is the continent of the future. It is I'm convinced that it is the center of the world. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Why? Yeah, it is a young continent, the youngest continent in the world. That is a guarantee for the future. I think it's better to be the youngest continent than the oldest continent in the world. Because there are here future consumers, future citizens, future workers. It is the quarter of the humanity, of the mankind in 2050. It is something extraordinary. It is a new cycle for Africa. For the first time in its very, very long history, we will live a new demographic cycle, something that is, historical. The geography, 60% of the available areas, lands, are in Africa. That is something amazing. The world will come to Africa to exploit this. People, women, for example. I think that the female leadership is a huge experience in Africa now. And we could take this continent as an example. Politically speaking, for example, we have so many female parliaments, like in Rwanda, for example, in Senegal also. That is something extraordinary. Innovation also. That is the phenomenon of leapfrog. They don't have electricity, but they have, mobile banking, for example, much more than us. That is something historical also. According to the World Bank, where I work as consultant, Africa might be on the brink of economic takeoff, just like China 30 years ago and India 20 years ago. That is something really interesting. But the most interesting thing I think the challenge, I talked about the opportunities, but the most important challenge is, for me, is life. I mean, we have the feeling that life is not so, important in Africa. When people die, they die massively. You see, 200 people, 200 people died in Mali through an attack a few months ago. And so we had that at the top of the news one day, and after that, if this happened in Europe, we would be still in grief now. There is something about life: police violence, prostitution, rape in DRC, the eastern areas. Something very, for me, important to take in account: life, African life. I think if we undermine African lives, it is because of slavery, the time when we regarded these lives as not important. And African people themselves have integrated that idea that their life is not so important as the life of the others. I think it's time to finish with that, because now the continent of the future, the continent of today, the continent of yesterday, must consider life as the most important thing for its history and its future. So for me, that here are the opportunities and the challenges for.
Thank you for that really powerful account, Ambassador. So Josh, let me ask you to sort of key off that, if the challenges and opportunities that you see, but maybe also whether you think that the administration's New Africa strategy is sort of properly focused on what those promises and perils are. It has the 3 pillars of promoting prosperity, strengthening security, and promoting stability. Is that the right focus?
Yeah, I think so, and I'll pick up where the ambassador left off, because I absolutely agree with her assessment of the economic opportunities on the continent. They are really incredible, and we could spend our whole time just giving statistics that demonstrate the case. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really hopeful about the administration's New Africa strategy, because the trade and investment piece is a core pillar of it. Now, of course, administrations, including at least the previous 2, have talked about trade, not aid. This has been a mantra, and so everyone sort of pays lip service to it. And the actual focus of American foreign policy towards Africa hasn't changed much. But I think we might, that it might be different this time around. For one, it just sort of philosophically fits with the president's worldview. He's famously a businessman, and so he's convinced of the merits of FDI and trade. And 2, it's been easy to observe, if you live in Washington, that it's been easy to observe the effort that the administration has already put into making the Prosper Africa part of the initiative effective. There's dedicated people working on this. It is financed, and they're doing listening tours and really truly trying to get as much input as possible. So I'm encouraged by that. I think it's the right approach, and I think this time it may actually lead to some substantive refocus of American foreign policy. It's something we really, really have to do, because as the Secretary mentioned, American foreign policy hasn't evolved to account for the New Africa in many ways. We're still very focused on overseas development assistance and counterterrorism and mitigating crises of various types. And those are all important and worthwhile initiatives to pursue. But many other countries in the world have recognized that Africa is increasingly strategic. It's an increasingly important continent, and U.S. strategy has not evolved to account for that. So I think that this Prosper Africa initiative does recognize that. As far as challenges, there's many, and the Secretary mentioned some, and the Ambassador here as well. I would say governance, if you had to boil it down to one central problem. The state of governance on the continent is really disheartening. It's gone through ebbs and flows, and right now we're in a more worrisome time, I would say, particularly when you think about the democracy backsliding on the continent. So when you have poor governance, it's linked to economic paralysis. Very hard to create really positive environments for FDI, as the Secretary was talking about in his remarks. It's linked to poor outcomes in health, in security, all of these issues. And so if you cannot, if you can't get that part of it right, then I fear we'll still be talking about these sorts of problems 20, 30, 40 years from now.
So, but maybe we can pick up there. I have a feeling IRI might have a certain interest in the question of governance.
Correct.
But it certainly seems like there is something afoot in the continent with people demanding more from their governments. We've seen it in Algeria. We're seeing it in Sudan. There's areas of promise like in Ethiopia and areas of concern as well. How do we make sure that the governance piece is fit into the Africa strategy? How do we make sure, and how does it fit into a prosperity strategy, a trade strategy? What is its place, and what are the tools that we have to ask African governance to do better by their own people?
Thank you very much, Blaise, and thank you for hosting this. I think there are a couple of things that I want to discuss along with this. One, when we talk about challenges and opportunities, I think we have to go back to definition. We often talk about the devil being in the details. But I think when it comes to Africa, the devil is in the definition. It's in the way that we define Africa. What do we see when we look at Africa? Do we see, we hear terms like emerging market. I would not want my place to be called an emerging market, because whose emerging market is it? Is it for the investor who's coming from the outside, or is it from the people who live there? Is that kind of go son, go west, my son, go west, the opportunity is over there? In which case it's pretty worrisome. The other side of that coin is, in the case of the United States, how does the United States define itself vis-a-vis Africa? Africa is evolving. My colleagues have put that very well. But is the US evolving its engagement towards Africa? Those are the questions we should be asking. So how do we define it? If we look at the demographics that are changing, if you look at natural resources, if you look at all the potential, they've always been there. But when we hear the Africa strategy, I think it has a lot of potential there. But we have to ask about the prioritization of those potentials. If we talk about trade, then that presupposes a certain number of things. The big companies, the people are producing, governance is doing well, then we can trade kind of equal to equal. But that's not exactly what's happening. If we talk about trade, it presupposes that we have the skill set. Education is a big challenge for the African continent. If we talk about trade, we talk about security. But if we look at the strategy, we're talking about combating terrorists, that's not exactly how Africans are defining their own security challenges either. So there's an issue there. Whose security exactly are we defining here? Who's terrorists? For whom? Against whom? So this brings me to, I think the order can be, the strategy can be bolder, and it can be much more stronger. And the order probably needs to be inverted a little bit. Because, traditionally, our strategy in the US has been the 3 Ds, right? Development, defense, and democracy. We need to focus on democracy. Of course, IRI are in that business, democracy and governance. But if you're not going to have good governance most of the time if people are not putting their own input into what's going in their country. We have had cases of strong leaders who have emerged, and maybe they've pushed some governance. It's not sustainable because it becomes about one man and his sheer will, power, and all that stuff. Eventually, what we're seeing transformation. So to go back to Rama and Joshua's point, transformation is happening. So we've seen countries on one side that have recognized that, the leadership of the country, that's where Ethiopia is on one spectrum. They've seen that there is no avoiding change. And they've taken the steps to start to embrace that change so that the entire project, Ethiopian project, does not collapse. Well, we also see what's happening in Sudan. They're also taking stock of change, but that change is being imposed from the outside, not from the leadership structure. And we're seeing, so I think there's a framework here, an entire spectrum of issues So I would say the onus is on us on this side of the Atlantic, on who are we. The U.S. has the highest favorability rates on the continent of all the Western powers, including China, which is not Western, but is a very important power in Africa. The reason being, African at large embrace the same values the U.S. espouses: democracy, freedom. People in Lalibele, people in Goma, people in Harare know more about Kim Kardashian than I do. So they're following what we follow. They want the same thing. They all subscribe to 50 Cent motto, get rich or die trying, right? So they want wealth. They're not Congolese kids, Zimbabwean kids, Angolan kids will not be quoting Mao Zedong. Okay? So I just want to put that out to tease us.
So maybe on that point, Josh, I could come to you because you did mention sort of that other countries have noticed the strategic potential of China perhaps earlier than the U.S. has. And from that view, it seems like there can also be a tension between what Membo was talking about and sort of the longer term focus on transformation and political change, and the short term interest that the U.S. might see in trying to make sure that it gets ahead of competitors or enhances or maintains its influence in Africa. Could you talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of other countries' priorities in Africa and how that might fit with what the U.S. is pursuing under the new Africa strategy?
Sure. I think it's clear when you read the Africa strategy that part of the motivation is the realization that there are other actors, many other actors, now making extraordinary inroads into Africa. And some of those actors are geostrategic competitors to the United States. And the Secretary in his prepared remarks didn't say China, but he referenced China on a number of occasions. And China is, of course, the great concern for the United States for a whole host of reasons. I think one that is perhaps particularly relevant given this governance discussion that we're having is that China appears to assert an illiberal influence on African governance, and that happens in a host of ways. One is the corruption of its companies, where a McKinsey study several years ago that went around interviewing Chinese enterprises on the continent found that 60, depending on which country they were in, 60 to 87% admitted to paying a bribe to receive a license or a contract. And that has a really negative effect, obviously, on governance. And then there's just the model of the Chinese authoritarian system, which is the most authoritarian it's been probably since Mao. When you look at what's happening in Xinjiang, where maybe up to 2 million ethnic and religious minorities are in re-education camps, which are essentially gulags. So that's a negative model, and that affects the United States. The United States realizes that it's in its strategic interest to encourage the growth of democracy throughout the world. And it's not just China either. Of course, we have Gulf states that are heavily involved in particular regions, especially East Africa, the Horn, and they can sometimes behave in ways that are also not conducive to good governance, where they may spread easy money around to politicians and things of that nature. So I think that the Africa policy that the U.S. is still working on, really, particularly the Prosper Africa piece, is both informed by that and designed to try to augment the U.S.'s position on the continent and serve as a positive countervailing force to some of these negative forces.
So, Ambassador, maybe I could ask you how this discussion that we've been having here, how those same questions are seen in Europe and in Paris and elsewhere. Are those same opportunities and challenges perceived by European policymakers? Do they have the same objectives and concerns as those that are expressed in the Africa policy? Obviously, there's been cooperation between the U.S. and French and the G5 Sahel and some of the counterterrorism missions. But where is there potential for greater convergence of U.S. and European policy?
About Africa?
Yes.
Powerful nations, they follow their strategic interests. So they will converge if they have common strategic interests. They won't converge if they don't have any strategic common interests. Now, It's interesting to see that we are at the crossroads because things are changing very fast in Africa. But minds in Europe are not changing so fast, unfortunately, because of fear. They fear these African youth, they fear migrants who arrived in Europe. You can see when we have elections in France or in any European country, the high level of the alt-right in the polls, in the results. So that is a huge political pressure on European democracies, you know. So it is not only, you know, I think it will be a long-term fear, and that is a problem to see the new Africa, to see the opportunities we talked about. They don't see the opportunities we talk about. They only see people who are a threat for the European future. Borders, education system, welfare, social welfare system, that make them blind, you know, on African realities. You have to know that the relationship between Africa and European countries is very specific. It is different from the relationship between Africa and the United States because of the historical links. We talk about former colonial powers. I mean, France or Great Britain or Portugal, Italia. These countries have very strong links with African countries, but it is the flawed regard, you know, look. There is something depressed in these relationships. There is something unhealthy now. And on the other hand, in Africa, things are changing because new generations would like to break these unhealthy relations. You have two Africas. You have the Africa of governments who have the same links as before, and you have the new generations who try to open their minds on the rest of the world, and they try to develop new relations with the United States, with Turkey, with Korea, Japan, Morocco. There are so many new partners possible now in Africa that we are at the crossroads. So in Europe, it's difficult to make people understand what is going on now because of that fear. Maybe in a few years with new generations, but the future is a problem because more and more people imagine that someday, I don't know, Marine Le Pen in France will come at the head of the state. So which sorts of relations will have France with Africa? I think that is something very important that is going on now. And I don't know if they can appreciate the weight of history, but some opportunities are still possible if both parts try to work with migrants who live there in European countries since decades or centuries, because they are now French, they are British, they are Portuguese, they are Spanish, and African also. They have two cultural contents, and that is a chance for Europe to have these people on its land. But once again, European people and countries should understand that it is a chance and not a problem. So that is another story.
Thank you. Emma, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to add to what the ambassador said. I think for us on the side of the Atlantic, again, we talked about opportunities. That definition I was talking about is key, because once we properly define what the various parties are, there's tremendous room for partnerships. You know, most Africans are not looking for ends out. Most Africans want to contribute to governance where they are. And of course, one of the sure vehicle of that is democratization. So you have open government, you have people whatever shape it is. I mean, we're not trying to impose U.S. model, but a democracy is a democracy is a democracy. Norway is different from Sweden, is different from France, is from the UK, from here. Botswana is not Ghana. So, but we see the shift with the youth that are demanding a bigger share of the pie, the national pie. And they want, ideally, they would like to stay where they are. I mean, nobody wakes up out of Botswana and say, I want to go to some cold climate to go live. Yeah, it's like, it's just nice over here under the tropic. We want to stay here, right? But those realities, I really feel strongly that will not come if the people are not represented at the table of their own government, their own administration. So I think it behooves us to push partnerships. Trading is good, commercial is good, but people need to get to do the trade. They have to get the product together. We have AGOA, we have other things. I think PEPFAR, MCA have been really solid, and I think it will be very difficult to top those projects going down the line, because they really elevate countries. I mean, Botswana, PEPFAR made a huge difference in Botswana. Botswana is a wealthy country, but they have some serious challenges. So with the youth, I think there's a lot of room there for us to do more. My first English teacher was a Peace Corps volunteer. In a lot of countries, they no longer have Peace Corps. So I just think we need to start thinking beyond. We have to focus more on that one of the Ds, and democracy is important. I think, and with democracy, we need to also redefine what we call stability, because part of the challenge on this side of the Atlantic is how we define stability for the others.
Thanks, Mabut. With that, we have about 10 minutes, so let me throw it open to the audience. We do have microphones coming around. Please be sure to introduce yourself and actually end your statement with a question mark, not just a period. All the way in the back, please.
Henry Hetker, retired government. We have a current crisis with the trade issue with China, and the cancellation of all the contracts for soybeans has led to a tremendous surplus of them, and that provides a problem to the U.S. taxpayer. I wonder, is there any way to further the sale of the soybeans to African states? I know we can't, take some specific company and say this company wants to sell something, but we can look at it in general and then have African state leaders or governments or companies then approach companies through some sort of mechanism. Has this been thought of as a way of furthering this sale?
Thank you. Any insights on soybean sales to Africa?
Well, no, but I would say that'd probably be hard. I don't know what the market in Africa is for soybeans, what the appetite is, which is obviously a key part of this equation. In my time there, I'm not sure I ever encountered a soybean. So it's obviously Asia is a much, much, much larger market just for cultural reasons, but also the realities of the population. So, and I don't know how long you can store soybeans, for instance. So I think there's some logistical problems as well. But I haven't heard any. I'm not in government, of course, but in my movements on the periphery of government, I haven't heard any discussions around that.
Right here in the middle.
Hi, Adam Valavenis with the Crisis Group. Just wondering, in West Africa, with the United States pulling out, I think it's 2,000 or a few thousand of their troops that we have stationed there, as Islamist groups kind of march south into Burkina Faso. What, I guess, what does that signal for what the future of U.S. defense relations and security relations, but also perhaps even democracy relations looks like in the region?
Thank you. Do you want?
I think that's the part of the challenges, one of the challenges that I was mentioning. It's like, how do we engage Africa? If our second Africa point on the Africa strategy is countering terrorism, and then we're pulling out, what message does it send? Do we stay and re-engage in terms of building the type of armies that Africa need? By that I mean there's only one type of the military that Africa needs, what we call the Republican Army. And the Republican Army is an army that represents the people. an army that is outside the politics of it. I mean, it's a dying breed in Africa. There are only about 6 or 7 of them out of all the countries that we have. There again, I think it's tremendous opportunity so that we can define security and stability as it reflects the need of the local populations. I think this is part of the challenge we've had with AFRICOM. Nobody seems to understand all the contours of what AFRICOM is and what the end goal is. They do good work, so this is not I'm not criticizing AFRICOM, I'm just saying it's such a unique system, a unique structure, even within the US military. It's not a command like any other command. So when decisions are being made affecting that space, which is, by the way, the same space with democracy, because instability often means the breakdown in governance, the breakdown in representation. That's what so it's the same coin, really. It's very challenging. I think the US may have to go back to the drawing board. I don't know. I spend time in the military. I'm not an expert on AFRICOM, but I think the mixed message is there.
Maybe I'll just supplement that real quick. General Waldhauser, the outgoing commanding general of AFRICOM, has addressed this, and the drawdown is going to be about 600 troops, 10% of 6,000, and it's happening in in a staggered sequence. So, and he has assured that sort of the warfighting function or capabilities of these units will not be affected by the drawdowns, and they're not going to happen all at the same time immediately. So I think the problems in the Sahel can't be solved even, you could send 10,000 American troops there and you wouldn't solve the problems in the Sahel. So I think having a presence there, a military presence, is important, but there needs to be, I don't think that's the critical key.
I heard this morning on the radio that we should leave the Sahel. Troops should leave, international troops, national troops, because it's impossible to win that war. It's more and more difficult to win wars in Africa and everywhere in the world. It's difficult because we know that the solution, as you say, I think, is on the ground, in the people. It is not. You can't rely only on military solutions about Africa. As you can see in the DRC, there is the huge number of, the most important number of UN troops in the world, MONUSCO, and it had been lasting since 20 years, more than 20 years. And on the other hand, you see in countries as Algeria or Sudan, the people is in the streets and they try to gain their own liberty, independence, and autonomy. That is something interesting, because in these countries, who is at the head of the state? A military society, a military head of state. That is something interesting, but the people is still in the street. They want a civil government, not a military government. That means that a huge level of maturity, of democratic maturity. I have always heard that African people should live under, stability, but military stability, authoritarian governments. But this fierce desire of democracy shows that they want to live free, not under military governments or with international troops on their soil, So I think that we should never forget why international troops are in Africa. The final objective, the final aim is to quit, to leave. Otherwise, they will be defeated by a too long military situation. We have understood that in other regions in the world. It is the same in Africa also.
Maybe over to this side in the back.
Hi, Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst here in Washington. I was wondering if you can talk more about Sudan. I believe this morning the African Union has voted to suspend Sudan's membership to this body. I think the Prime Minister of Ethiopia is trying to go to Sudan to mediate between the government and the opposition, the civilian movements. What do you think the U.S. should do when it comes to, what more can the U.S. do when it comes to Sudan? Thank you.
Maybe I'll just take one more question from the second row here, and that'll be our last question, and we'll do a quick lightning round.
Hello, my name is Alka Bhatnagar. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I was very, very fortunate to have worked in Sub-Sahara region and worked with the YALI and the Mandela Washington Fellows. The Secretary had mentioned quite a bit that how great these YALI Fellows are, and I have also worked. What do you think about the educational investment by the United States institutions in Africa to build up the skills development?
Thank you. So a question on Sudan and a question on investing in education. Do you want to start, Ambassador, and we'll go down the line?
About Sudan, it is interesting what is happening there. I think that without interference, but what does it mean? We must show that we are behind them because they face a repressive situation now. Since yesterday, 100 people died in the streets after being slaughtered by the army. So that is the case of human rights there, democratic and human rights. And people who slaughtered the demonstrators in the street, we know them very well. They acted in South Sudan, in Darfur, a few years ago, and now, still now, because nobody talks about the Darfur and what's going on there. But the situation is still very, very difficult, and people are still dying there. And the killers are now in Sudan, where they are killing demonstrators in the streets. So I think that the only thing we can do is to be by their side and behind them. We don't have to decide. They decide because they mastered their revolution. They could have, you know, gone at their home saying that Bashir is out, he's gone. Now the revolution is finished. No, it is not finished. In Algeria, it's the same. They want to keep their revolution, and they want a democratic power, a civil government, and I'm sure they'll do it. But we have to make them feel that we are behind them because they face something very tough.
Thank you. Josh, quickly.
Sure. I think sometimes the U.S. and other countries actually overestimate the amount of influence it has in certain countries or with certain countries. And we do have a whole array of tools and influence measures that we can use, but they're only effective up to the point where, in Sudan's case, the regime has core interests at stake. The regime's core interest in Sudan is to maintain power. It will not negotiate itself out of power. It will have to be forced in some way. And the U.S. is not going to do that, nor is anybody else going to do that. Protesters will somehow have to do that if they're able. I'm skeptical they are. So so you have two immovable forces. You have the Transitional Military Council, which has proven that it will not leave peacefully. And then you have the protesters who have also proven that they will not accept just a cosmetic change at the top of the government without systemic reforms throughout the government that leads to real civilian-led governance. So something had to give, something did give on Monday with the massacre of the protesters in front of the Ministry of Defense in Khartoum, but also in other cities in Sudan. And I think we're going to see more confrontations like this because I expect there to be more bloodshed, unfortunately.
And the last word on Sudan or education.
Well, so I think we have that spectrum I'd referred to earlier, and we have Algeria, Sudan, and Ethiopia. So these three cases actually encapsulate the challenges that we face in Africa now, i.e. people want self-determination, people want to be at the table of governance, of decision-making. How do we engage? I think we have to continue engaging. By that I'm talking the US, on the side of democracy, on the side of the people. In the case of Sudan, they made it clear that they want to be the drive of this, the Sudanese people, but they need our help. And I think the US, as part of the Troika, is trying to help that. The fear is that what we worried about most has arrived. That's the violence now people are shedding. But we cannot retract our support. We have to continue forward. Places like Ethiopia, they've shown that they have the will from within. We have to continue supporting them because, of course, that also came about through a lot of violence before. Algeria underscored the other point of this process, that is, transition is difficult. Transition takes long, and transition can derail quickly. Elections are not the only thing, it's not the panacea. So in the case of Algeria, I think they are caught in that space when they're trying to do things right. They just postpone the elections because you have to have the right process in place. You have to have the right candidate to avoid what can come. So it's a very tricky, very fragile situation when you're transitioning. In terms of the question about education and investing, I think it's very important because in all these three cases, eventually it's about institutions. Who runs institutions are the people who have the skill set and the leadership, which are two different things, but they often go together. And so it behooves in that Africa strategies, there is room for that. There's no good trade if the people are not trained. There is no counterterrorism or anything if the people are not well trained. And there's definitely no democracy if the people are not trained.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Please look forward for future analysis and events here at Hudson. Thank you.
Okay, I think
Great job.
I hope we did okay.
No, you did very well. I read your remarks.
Okay, thanks.
Great job.